left off, we were talking about kind of what grace looks like to us and the impact that it has on us. So when we talk about this, it creates this space space for freedom. I think I made mention of the fact to you guys that if you really want to learn a new response, then you better have a context of grace to learn it in. The interesting thing, I don't know if anybody watched the blowout on Saturday and Sunday. Both the CU Buffs got blown out, and then also the Broncos did. But it's interesting to watch the loss of morale around that. And I always am fascinated by how the players handle themselves when they make a mistake. And one of the wideouts for the Broncos, Sutton, fumbled twice, and they just got boat raced by the Dolphins. But he fumbled twice, which gave them another possession in order to score, essentially. And all he could do is sit on the bench. His head hung, and hitting himself in the head with his helmet on would be what he does. And it gives you a little bit of a clue of what the internal dialogue is like for how we handle making mistakes. It may not be as game-changing as his, but sometimes it is, and we don't really let ourselves off the mat at all when it comes to that. So it doesn't mean I don't care. It doesn't mean I won't make changes. It doesn't mean any of those things at all. It just means that, okay, I expected to make a mistake because I'm human. Not that I want to make a mistake. I strive not to. But when I do, then what do I do? That's the issue. Not so much a matter of what kind of theoretically I will do. Okay, so and then just learning more about ourselves. I dare say that Sutton didn't learn anything. Well, he learned something new about himself in that game, but I don't know that he learned anything about himself going forward. He probably does. I mean, if you watch any player who's made some pretty significant mistakes in a ball game, the next game is really the issue, not the one he blew up with his fumbles or whatever, because how well he can gather himself. And you hear players talk about it all the time, having a short memory and being able to turn the page and all the other idiotic metaphors they use. And that's just a way of saying that either I'm going to let myself off the mat and learn a new way, or I'm going to continue to punish myself and think that actually will change my behavior. And in the short term, I mean, that's the problem, right? In the short term, it does. So how do we experience grace is what I want to talk about a little bit. And the first thing that we experience is grace as pardon, which is a double-edged sword in a lot of ways, in the sense that I think we treat grace in a lot of ways very much this way, is that if somebody is struggling or whatever, and they say, I need a little grace. So some kind of easing of the expectations. Now, that doesn't say anything about the expectations they have in their own head. So we can ask somebody else to give us some grace, but how well do we really receive grace if we're not going to give ourselves any, really? We make ourselves pretty immune to it. So experiencing it as pardon is actually the antidote, if you will, or the answer to guilt that we experience. And as we said, guilt is not bad. It motivates us to change. It's measuring up to some standard we hold, and not a perfectionistic one, because that's not a standard. Standards remain in place. Perfectionistic standards float upwards. So the minute I get close, it goes up more. So I'm always in a state of what? Never enough. That's why we use that phrase. So the answer to shame is acceptance. And so we experience grace as an acceptance. I think in a lot of ways, we're going to be very shocked at our interactions with Jesus. Now, obviously, we're transformed by death and moving into his presence, but at the same time, our interactions with him, if we were to have a memory, which I don't know whether we will or we won't, is yeah, but what about all that stuff that I did? What about the mistakes I made? What about the things I did to let people down and let you down? And those kinds of things end up creating an insulation for us against accepting the grace that's offered us in terms of acceptance. And that's where this comes into play. Because, like I said, shame is a very, very effective motivator. And it accomplishes things in the short term. It cannot be sustained in the long term. That a sustained change does not happen. All I have to do is point to any kind of addiction people want to change, porn addiction, whatever, and they use shame to try to change it. And then they wonder why they can't change, because they cycle back to it again because it just simply can't be sustained. What that means is, how do I apply grace under those circumstances? And the issue isn't so much condemning myself and trying to avoid being condemned, and that's what changes my behavior, but transforming my motivation into love, moving toward God in love rather than running away from him in shame. And that, one friend of mine once said, if you want to know whether you're motivated by shame or not, watch your response toward God when you make a mistake or you sin. Do you hide or do you run toward? And the hiding has been in us since the garden. Because the funny thing about it is when God asked them, and he was in the garden, he says, where are you? Like he didn't know. But why would he do that? It's not to trap Adam and Eve. It wasn't to trap them at all. It was to invite them to accept their state. We are hiding. And then he said, what have you done? Again, not said in a way to catch anybody, because obviously he already knew, but it was to give them an opportunity to own their own behavior and their own choices. And we don't see it that way. Somebody says to you, why did you do that? You're already scrambling to come up with a reason because you're already, quote unquote, in trouble. That's what the word why does for us. So we experience it as a pardon. We experience it as acceptance. We can also experience it as power. Give me the grace to accomplish certain things. The power to move ultimately toward our true self. It's hard to move toward our true self when we've already condemned it. It's really hard to do. Why? Why would I want to do that? Because we're sure that if I accept it, I will never change it. Which really is an illusion and a lie that we've been told. Because if you accept it, the only way to change is accepting it. And so accepting it is the pathway to change, and it allows me to embrace my true self, not the broken one, the one that is defined by sin, but the one that's defined by redemption and who we are. We have a very Old Testament view of our hearts, and it's the Jeremiah, what is that, 37? What is that?
Heart's deceitfully wicked.
Wait a minute, say it?
The heart's deceitfully.
Yeah, and I think that's 37. But he said the heart is ultimately deceptive or deceitful. Who can know it? I mean, the irony is that there's an answer to the question. And we have that view of our heart rather than the one that Paul describes in 2 Corinthians when he says, you are now a new creation. And a new heart has been given in you. There's even foreshadows of that in the Old Testament when God says in Ezekiel, I will give them a new heart, and I will write my law on their hearts. So and I can be their God, and they can be my people. It's a changed, exchanged heart that we're talking about here. So, and then we also experience it as gratitude. Yeah, Brian.
I think my own struggle with that comes from, like, if I've given a new heart, then, like, why do I still these things.
Right.
And so I think there's almost a fear of, if I accept that I've been given a good heart, and law written on it, but like I'm still here, what does that mean?
Right.
So it's like almost the ambiguity within that,
Yeah, and we hate the uncertainty and ambiguity, right?
of course.
So it's much easier to land on one side or the other.
Well, I mean, there's levels of ambiguity, but then there's also like, did I? Like, did I really? Because like I'm still here.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like that moment, like, I don't know, like people become Christian, they're like, oh yeah, cool, like now I'm good. And it's like, oh, no, it's not true.
Yes and no, though.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's the problem, right? Is that we just want a definitive answer. We don't want yes and no in all of that. I mean, Paul's Romans 7, everybody knows. And it's this war that's within us between the new man and the old. And the issue, I think, for us is we want to tame the old man with law, which is why he came about in the first place. Instead of redeeming the old man further and further over time by grace. And that's the biggest difference, I think. So it looks like people that are actually living graciously, it looks like they're doing the very thing that Paul said in Romans when he said the people were saying we should sin all the more so that grace can even more abound. He's saying, may it never be. The issue is that grace actually empowers us to live responsibly with what the freedom is that we've been given. And that's the bigger issue in there. So people that are motivated by grace and by love look like they're licentious, when in fact they're just living free. And quite honestly, it's pretty messy looking. We'd rather have the cleanness of the law. I'm not sure I'm going to make it. Okay, yeah.
So I had a question on the sense of, so it says building towards our new self, and that idea of the reformed heart and the changed heart in God.
Yeah.
And one question I had in that is, so I know that it's really hard to see yourself change,
Right.
because you get caught up in, it's a slow enough change over time. It's like the frog in water, where it boils slowly. That's usually
Yeah.
it can be true for ourselves changing. And so it's, I guess the question is, what would you say is the thing that gives us the perspective to see ourselves change?
To see yourself
To
change?
see the change is that God? Is that other people?
Yes and yes. I think, see, the thing is I would rather you be oblivious to the change. It's just pursuing Christ and nothing else. And so the change occurs without my superintendence. It occurs because of my focus on Christ. Because as I bring my thinking and my choices and everything in alignment with Him, things will change. It may not change instantaneously, but they will change over time. And so it's kind of like Eugene Peterson called it, a long obedience in one direction. And that's really all it is. I think the problem is we want to know how far we are. We want to measure it and know where we are in this process. And that's what gets in our way. I mean, why did the Pharisees create the Mishnah? You know, it's an 800-pound book of laws to differentiate where they are relative to God. And I think what made Jesus so revolutionary is he's saying, love God. I mean, pursue God, not all this other trappings and stuff that's part of that. And on top of that, he said, I came to fulfill the law, not destroy it. So he did all of that. So we've got the freedom to choose rightly toward God and in relationship with Him and embrace the grace that we're offered to help that change along. So I guess I would rather see people be oblivious to their change and then have somebody come up and say, I don't think you have any idea how much you've changed. And they're going, really? I never noticed that. And it's like, yeah, that's the way it should be. It's not focusing on change, it's focusing on two things. Obedience, which is actually listening, not doing. So obedience and then following. And those two ultimately have to be connected together. The sidelight to this, I think some of you have heard me say this, is obedience. The core of the word in Latin is obdere, which is where we get auditory. So it means to listen intently. It doesn't have action connected to it. And what you often see, even in Scripture, is that Jesus says, he who hears me and does my word, he links those two things together for that very reason. So, yeah, Ellie.
I was talking to a friend the other day, and he was saying how he gets frustrated because he wants to make all these changes in his life, but he just keeps hitting a brick wall with it. But we also talked a bit about how he's kind of trying to do it without bringing it to God. Do you think true change is possible without going through God, or not really?
The short answer is no. I think certainly people make a lot of changes that aren't Christ followers, and they seem to sustain it for a very long time. I think the issue is, white knuckling it and getting into a pattern and a routine of changing things around. Sure, they can. The issue is for us, I think, is a transformation of our motivation, not so much just the behavior, because the behaviors are exactly the same. So you look at the behaviors and say, okay, both of these people are changing, but then the next question beyond that is, what's the motivation for that change? And so for somebody who wants to participate in the grace that's offered them, the motivation is that I want to express my love toward God. And my gratitude, like that up there says, the gratitude of the grace that I've been given. And so I want to handle that well. The other person is, I just have to keep going and everything will turn out okay. But there's no mention of motivational change in there. And I think that's the biggest difference between those two things. So can somebody transform? I doubt it. Can somebody reform? Oh yeah, we all do that. We settle for that all the time, actually, because it's way more comfortable than this transformation thing, because you got to trust somebody. That's really inconvenient. So, yeah, Brian?
Kind of what you were telling Levi reminded me of this lyric that I was trying to figure out if it was true or not. And it kind of feels like it is, just going with what you're saying. It's funny how we always turn into everything we're running from.
Yeah.
It's like we're so focused on man, I need to make sure I don't do that, make sure I don't do that. It's
right.
Of course, that's what you're going to do. That's all you think about.
Yep. You've just triggered the song in Levi.
No.
Yeah, or some song, I don't know what it is. See, yes, and the thing is I think it's the difference between heart transformation, heart development, and sin management. And sin management is I want to avoid these things. And heart development is actually both of those things. It's motivational change devoted to participating in my heart changing, which leads to the behavioral change ultimately. So it's kind of the direction we go. But yeah, you're right. I think there's kind of a embedded both and in there. But we are, it's funny. It really is. Well, I should say ironic. It's not funny. But I've had too many people that sit in my office, even at your guys' age, and say, well, I don't want to be my parents. I don't want to be my dad. I don't want to be my parent. Guess what is in the center of your rangefinder? That parent. So, story is told as a little boy a little boy that's in this parking lot, his dad takes him out there to teach him how to ride his bike. And he's finally gotten it and he's riding, and the dad says, whatever you do, don't hit the telephone pole. And he keeps his eye on it, and he rides, and what does he do? He runs right into it because it is in the center of his focus to avoid. Because wherever our attention is, that is where we go. Yes, ma'am?
That's crazy. In my motor learning and performance class, I literally just learned about that. Like how, like if you're driving and you're like trying to avoid something, or like you're thinking about like that, like switching over lanes, and you know, like sometimes you find yourself like you're like literally
Drifting.
veering,
Mhm.
like, it is true. It's exactly that. It's because whatever you're focusing on, you're gonna do that. So if you're like trying to not hit something, that's why they say you should just focus on the road,
Right.
not anything else, because like we all gotta do that. Isn't
Wait.
that crazy? I learned about the same thing too in classes.
Go figure. And that fits our hearts. Whatever we focus on is what we head toward. So if I'm focused on, and I've known people, I've been in counseling long enough, I've known people long enough to have heard them say that, and lo and behold, what ends up happening? They end up being the very person that they don't want to be because they focused only on avoiding it. And quite honestly, when you think about it, it doesn't matter what direction you go when you're avoiding. It doesn't matter, right? It's just so it's away. That's it. On the other hand, if you're pursuing something, where you go does matter. And that's I think, the same focus that we're talking about here. Yeah, Lauren?
So, Dr. Demos touched on this concept in clinical counseling methods a little bit on the opposite perspective that you have, of that if we're focusing or like trying not to become something or focus on a thought or lead, like have that thought then lead to action.
Yeah.
But it's better actually to just like recognize that thought,
Mhm.
constantly trying to like push it to the back of your mind or not think about it, because
Right.
more likely when you're not thinking about it, you're gonna end up falling into it, whether it's instead of just like a thought pattern. So would you say that is the concept of like what we focus on leading towards like who we become and what we do and our actions applies more, I guess, in like a change concept versus like what Dr. Hughes was saying, more is sin and like habitual patterns, I guess, if that makes sense, like the transition, like change and sin versus focusing on change.
Yeah.
Get there versus.
Well, I mean, it's certainly some forms of change is sinful. It takes us away from God. It takes us away from, the things that he's told us to move toward. Those two views are probably complementary to one another rather than antithetical to each other, right? The thing is that what he's espousing is the acceptance thing. Is that if I don't accept that it's there, then my ability to actually change anything is very, very limited. Because it's, I'm saying it's not there. So that part of it, yes, indeed. I think how we handle our focus, rather than focus or not focus, how we handle our focus is everything. And so does that lead to behavior? Initially, maybe not. Yeah, I mean, there are a few people that are more aware of the substances they take than the people who take them, rather than the people that are looking from the outside in. So the same thing is true here, I think, is that if I'm going to focus on something and then accept that it exists, then I can start developing a structure around change that I need to make. So, yes, ma'am.
So, are you saying like, so basically like what to do in this is like you have to like accept that like this is like whatever it may be, like this is my inclination, or
Right.
like this is what I do that I don't like that I do. You have to like accept it and just be like, that is true, like that's what happens, and then like choose something else to be like, but I want to pour my focus into like being more like Christ, being in relationship with Christ, having intimacy with Christ, but like still saying like this is true, that like, I'm inclined to
Yeah.
do this, as like my flesh wants this,
Yeah.
but like then choosing to like focus on, rather than just being like no, like I don't,
Right.
because I
Yeah.
feel like that happens a lot like in like Christian like circles of like,
Mhm.
like push it down until it's not there anymore, but like that doesn't necessarily work. So is it just like, I guess,
Yeah.
is that like really just the concept of like being honest with God and yourself and just being like,
Yeah.
this is what it is.
Yeah, and sometimes we don't think that that will really change anything. But, you know, if I'm being clear about what I do, how I do it, my motivations for doing it, and I am also trying to hang on to my relationship with Jesus, then something's going to be incompatible with the other. And so then I have a choice to make about the kinds of things we do. Sometimes we try to focus on, if you think of it like food, we try to focus on not eating something rather than eating the food that is the most nutritious for us. So I avoid junk food, but I don't eat nutritious food. I just, you know, I do whatever. On the other hand, I eat nutritious food, but then I also avoid the junk food. But, and you know, in some cases, which you guys have learned about, you have people that will reject all food as a means of controlling doing it wrong. And so those pendulum swings do indeed tend to happen, I think, indeed, the way you're describing it. And that's the balancing act. That's kind of the gray of that living that we don't really like very much. So, yeah.
Do you think, kind of going off what you said, maybe a good way to think of that change? It's like, for example, let's say I'm like a super angry person and I like lash out at people, and then like in one direction I could be thinking about, oh, I need to like not lash out at this person, like stuff like that. But maybe instead of thinking about don't do this so much, think about, well, this is what I do want to do, and I'm going to focus on what I do want to do more than what I don't want to do, because if I focus on what I do want to do, I'll be more likely to do that thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's certainly clearly the case. I think it's, again, it's kind of the interaction effect. I focus on I want to resist doing what I shouldn't, and I want to emphasize doing what I should, just to put it simply. And so, yeah, that is it. On some days, it will be more of pursuing what I should do and less of being concerned about keeping myself from doing something. But I think in some cases at least, our faith has devolved down into keeping ourselves from doing something wrong. And that's a very one-sided faith, I think, where if that's all I'm doing, that's a sin management approach rather than a grace-fed heart development approach. Because ultimately, somebody who's angry better start looking internally about what's the engine behind that thing. Because they can change their behavior, but that doesn't change the engine. And so that's always going to be the backdrop of what you have to talk about, I think, even with something like you're describing with anger or anxiety or any number of things. There are underlying elements that drive that along that we need to understand what that's about. So a lot of times angry people have very, very, very rigid expectations of the world around them. And when it doesn't conform, they turn into intimidators, like we were talking about in the boundary stuff. So yeah, there's a complementarity between those. In some cases, you end up doing more of one than the other, and on other cases, the opposite. And that's the way it should be, really. So, okay, another one. What about grace and growth? The one observation I can make is children grow before they know anything at all about love and grace. They're growing up, most kids are growing up in a context of grace. Adults put up with a lot of stuff from kids, partly because they're just children and they don't know. And so there's grace in that. The funny thing, just a ironic thing that happened is that my eldest daughter is now a parent. And so she's got an 18-month-old that's running her ragged. And so we were sitting around talking a little bit one evening, and she, at one point in time, she led groups for me in this class as well. And we were talking a little bit about this, and she said, now that I'm a parent, I never realized how much grace I was given as a kid. And there's no mention of it. It's completely behind the scenes. You do not see it. But parents have to make a very legitimate, conscious decision to be gracious with their kids and allow them to grow at the speed at which they're growing rather than the speed at which they think they should grow. And that's a big, big issue. Kids grow up in that environment. It doesn't take long for that environment to begin to break down, and they begin to worry about the adult's opinion of them or their friend's opinion of them. And then shame enters the picture in a lot of cases because their ability to think internally, narratively, about themselves and telling the story about who they are jumps to the forefront. And I'm defined by the narrative I have. My eldest grandson is in elementary school. He's in 5th grade. And he has a particular friend who is a very, very big personality, fills the room wherever he is. And Grayson is a pretty quiet kid, very sensitive, very aware of his surroundings. And he gets swept along by this other kid because of just the power and force of who he is. And he's doing things and thinking things that he wouldn't normally think at all. And that's what drives him along, is that sense of belonging we'll talk about when we get to shame, right? He said, if I stand up against him and say, I don't want to do that, it's not a good idea to do it all, then his friend will come back at him and he's afraid that he'll lose the relationship with him. And see, that's the beginnings of it. Because in elementary school, it's kind of relationship 101, it's emotions 101, it's learning just the ropes of it in the context of the social environment that they're in, and it has a huge impact on them. So grace encourages growth because limits are expected. They're expected to happen and ultimately accepted. Now remember, accepted doesn't mean it's okay. They're accepted because they're reality. That's what happens. And so grace allows for crock-pot growth, not microwave growth. We like our product done quickly within the next 2 minutes rather than a lifetime of growth and regressions and progression and all the things that go along with it. It's very much a part of that backdrop. Same thing with learning. Grace and learning are always connected. Grace allows the space to make the kind of mistakes where we can get the information we need and be able to grow farther and learn more, really. I mean, the irony is, and a lot of you guys are interested in counseling, a lot of times the thing that I've seen in supervising counselors in training is they work too hard to get it right every time. And they're afraid that if they don't get it right, then their client somehow will suffer. And that's really underestimating how well defended your client actually is. And so being wrong in some respects, not that you try to go out of your way to be wrong, but if you guess wrong on something, in terms of reflecting back to that person, they'll correct you. And you'll probably get information that is far more useful than if you're right all the time with your guesses and your reflections and everything else. And so making an effort to maybe not hit it just right. You're not real sure what it is. You'll give it a shot, reflect back on to the person. They say, no, that's not quite right, but they're more than willing to change it for you because they want to be heard. And counseling oftentimes offers them the first opportunity to actually be heard by somebody and be listened to. So it allows to take the risk to try something new. That's why part of the challenge of your learning here with this class is being in a group. You risk doing things you wouldn't otherwise do, talking to quote unquote complete strangers. And listen, just one thing to remind you of. You're not sharing for them. You're sharing for you. Because whatever you share, you will own of your own stuff. when you say it, name it, and label it outside. So grace accepts the fact that learning takes time. It takes failures in learning. Look at all your pencil, mechanical pencils. On the other end, there's this little device that plans for your mistake, not digital ones. But they're all there. There's a eraser because it's planning for your mistake. If we're going to be true perfectionists, we would only have a pencil without an eraser. And we wouldn't even think of it. You couldn't even buy one. Yes? Well, and that's a lot of times people don't choose pens. Why? Yeah, and they can erase it. Unlike your notes, probably. So
They just have them
scribbling out, yes, and they can't tolerate that either. So, okay. The other thing is, and Henry Nouwen makes mention of the fact that forgiveness is grace in action. We should expect human weaknesses and limits, and therefore things will happen in relationship that we might get hurt by. We really undersell ourselves because if I get hurt by it, I won't ever recover. And so we do everything we can to avoid it. But instead, forgiveness is not about it's not about a trade. If I forgive you, then you will change. It's not about that at all. It is a one-way transaction, if you will, that somebody has hurt me, I have a choice to make, and either I can release them from my demand that they change, or I can continue to demand that they change and wait around long enough to see that change happen based on my behavior. And usually it's withdrawing behavior, it's silence, it's all sorts of manipulative ways we use to get people to conform, to admit they're wrong, right? And so forgiveness is grace in action, and that's why Henry Nouwen said, and I think it's true, and it understands that ultimately, how do we handle our own forgiveness without shame? Because our shame oftentimes is not is for the other person's benefit. Our shame is to demonstrate that we feel bad. But do we really change necessarily? And that's the backdrop to all of this. Is I've said this to you before. Shame insulates us from change. Grace empowers us to learn. And those two things go together in intertwined ways and so forth. So grace and forgiveness in everyday life, it realizes that grace is giving away what we could not afford to others who can't possibly repay their offenses. And forgiveness is not a trade. Forgiveness is a free offer of the grace of forgiveness that we offer somebody else. There's no guarantee they will change. That also means I got to be careful if I'm still around them to have good boundaries and protect myself. Yeah.
I think that sparked a thought in my head of maybe not something I've consciously thought, but then maybe subconsciously carried out in the sense of maybe not thinking, but internally believing, if I hate myself, they'll see that and stop looking like they hate me.
Right. It's preemptive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is just stupid.
No, but it works. It works exquisitely, or we wouldn't be using it, really.
Yeah. In the long run, it's stupid, but it does work.
Minor detail.
We get the pity points that we need.
Yeah.
But we just end up.
Or they just feel sorry for us and leave us alone. That works too. That's the insulation part of it.
Yeah.
It really is. It's the insulation. It's like, well, no, wait a minute. I didn't really count on him being so self-loathing about something he did to me. Nah, I'm going to back off on that and save you from yourself. So
then the irony is when they start to be like kind to them to us, you're like, wait, no, you can't,
That's right.
you can't do that.
That's, I'm not done yet.
You should do that.
That's right, I'm not done yet. I haven't done finished punishing myself, leave me alone. That's how that works.
It's so weird.
Yeah. Yeah. So grace and self-acceptance always go together. That's why we have, ultimately, I have you all reading, and I think most of you guys have read The Gift of Being Yourself, and that's why I have you read that book, is that myself is a gift. It isn't something that I condemn and hide and all of the things that go with it. But it cultivates a humility and also a sense of need, and we already talked a little bit about that. It's not being needy that we're talking about. It's just a sense of need, and I need people in my life. I need their eyes. I need their support and encouragement. I may not always get it, and I probably have to have a wider social network of people that if one can't come through, somebody else will. Sometimes it's not even people that you anticipate or you plan out at all. But ultimately it commits learning instead of knowing. Knowing is a static thing. There's information I gather and I know, I curate it, I use it in various situations. But learning is an ongoing enterprise. And grace makes that possible in so many ways in our own lives and how we do it. So the whole idea of self-acceptance in our way of thinking oftentimes means that if I just accept myself as I am, then I really won't change and I'll just stay the way I am. But that depends on what motivates the self-acceptance. I mean, today in the world that we're in, self-acceptance it's the affirmation of bad behavior and affirmation of everything bad in me and just claiming that it's good when it isn't. But self-acceptance doesn't settle for that. It's looking through the lens of grace, and grace doesn't shrink back from portraying or making clear our flaws and our limits, because they're not fatal. They're not fatal. And there are plenty of times in journals past that I've written, and I will end up saying in the margin, welcome to being human. And it's like, I've had people say that, I don't want to be human. I don't want to be human. And it's like, well, this is really awkward. Have you looked in the mirror lately? You're not a lizard. So, yeah.
Maybe this is kind of what you're talking about, and I'm just not understanding it. But like talking about like all of the self-acceptance stuff, and going along with like the stained glass analogy, and like learning like what we are behind the stained glass, like especially if you spend a lot of time with your stained glass, like how do you even like practically begin to like look at like what's behind it? Because like if you spent so long, like, because like
Right.
thinking of like if you're telling this lie to everybody else of like
Yeah.
telling this lie of like this is who I am, this is what I always do, this is, then like you eventually start to believe yourself.
Yep.
If it's a lie. So like how do you even practically like begin to look at like who like what you actually are, and like then be able to accept it? Because I feel like
Yeah.
with like that thing, if it's just like, well, if this is what I've like portrayed for everybody to see, like eventually I just start to believe like that's what it really is. Even though that-
Yeah, and we're encouraged, right? By the world around us, we're encouraged to keep it that way. I mean, the reality is that in a lot of cases, our interactions with other people is one stained glass interacting with the other stained glass. It's not really person to person. And so, I think in the symposium I mentioned that one of the prime opportunities we have to dismantle the stained glass is some kind of crisis of some sort. Maybe it's a physical one, maybe it's a spiritual one, struggling with losing one's faith, or any number of things that are all part of the kind of landscape of crisis people experience. And that's the stuff that then says, okay, I've always thought that there's a better way, there's something more than what I've experienced. And something, there's a chink that has gotten knocked into this, and I see outside, and I see there's other ways to do life than this. And usually it takes certain people in our lives who are the safe and have probably gone the journey themselves that call us out from behind the stained glass. But then when we come out, we end up having to introduce ourselves to ourselves because we've hidden for so long. And I think nothing short of, intentional group interactions from other people that are on that journey too, we will get input from them about that. That doesn't mean we're going to immediately change, but it really is input over time that accomplishes that. So, and that's basically what I said. It takes a crisis. It takes self-reflection about, I thought life was supposed to be this way and it's not. And then finally feedback from safe others. And that's the context in which it occurs. I can tell you that my spiritual journey changed dramatically because of a crisis. And it wasn't a crisis of falling off the roof. It was a crisis of, I thought, just to illustrate it, how many of you guys have seen The Chosen? Okay, second season, third episode, and the story is about Nathaniel. And every time I watch that episode, I look at it and say, that was me. Because he said, I've made all of this stuff for you. And now you don't see me, you don't hear me, you're not there. And so I had to reevaluate what my relationship was with Jesus versus my relationship with the church. And I had expectations that the church would fulfill what only Jesus can fulfill. And it was ministry in the church, was that for me. Now, everybody has a different story and a different desert to walk across. And mine lasted way long. And that's probably why I'm highly cynical of Christianese, because I got tired of the language and just wished for the reality of it. And so, that you find people on the journey as you're moving along. I think you find people like that. And they have crashed and burned. They have done their own soul searching. They're on the journey too and saying, hey, yeah, me too. Let's walk this for a while together as long as God allows it. And yeah, that's what it's there for. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a combination of inputs that allow me to see myself as I am, not as I portray myself to be. And if you've ever been in any of the Hollywood stages of people, you can see the old Western towns and they only have a facade. And you walk through them and there's nothing on the backside except props. That's kind of how we operate. We've got that in front. As long as you interact with that up front, it's good. But if you walk through the door, there's nothing here but props and supports and me. And I'm not sure I trust you with that. So, yeah, Ellie.
Kind of back to the grace and forgiveness part that you were just talking about. I know, for a while growing up, I had this bad habit of, whenever I'd feel shame, I'd try to, self-punish myself.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing, super big, but I'd be like, oh, I, did this thing today, so I'm not going to hang out with friends for the rest of the week, or just, things like that.
Right.
What do you think motivates, that kind of shame? Because for me, it wasn't I was oh, look, I am putting myself, but I would, isolate myself in that and, wouldn't talk to others about it or, wouldn't show others.
Yeah. No, we grow up in that culture. And that is, if you've done something wrong, someone has to be punished. And so even if somebody offers you grace, that doesn't mean you don't suffer consequences, okay? But if somebody offers you grace, it's like Brian was saying, no, I ain't done yet. And so it's like I have a certain set amount of punishing to do in order to expunge the shame that I feel over what happened. And does it accomplish that end? In reality, it feels like it is, but in reality, it doesn't really accomplish that end at all, because I end up going back to doing what I did before anyway. So the challenge then is, we sidestep the self-reflection part and don't take the time to cultivate an ability to accurately self-reflect without shame. That's hard to do, but it can be done. As far as what are my motives, what happened, what do I regret, and certainly in my life I've learned over the years of journaling and stuff like that I'll journal about some interaction I've had with my wife or one of my kids or whatever, and lo and behold, what comes out of it is I go back to them and say, I handled that really all wrong. Up until that point, I thought I was justified in how I handled myself. But then it's like God's voice and the Holy Spirit is sitting symbolically sitting in the presence of Jesus and saying, this is what happened, this is how it went, this is why I'm so pissed about it. And he's going, and it's like, and nothing, just justify me, please. And it's like, no, you've got the grace to change. What are you going to do with that? And so I think there's a lot of that punishment motif. Your parents have grown up with it. Their parents have grown up with it. And so we're generations into this shame-based parenting approach. And to such a degree, they don't even know they're doing it. So I'm not blaming anybody or throwing anybody's parents under the bus. But they're not aware because they don't frame it for their kids to say, I love you, I will always love you. But what you did, behavior, was out of line and inappropriate. There are consequences to be had for that, period. Now, you can't stop a kid from making the conclusions, but if a parent is aware at all, they can say, I know where your thoughts are going because I've been there. I know what that's like. So don't make this connection that way. And so what you do is you end up growing your kids into being shame resistant, as Brené Brown talks about, is that they could identify when it's happening, know that something's off, and be able to resist against it rather than just, as she said, we're not going to be shame-free ever, because it's been part of our spiritual DNA forever. So yeah, Larry.
So I was talking to a non-believer yesterday
Mm-hmm.
about terms had to try to describe grace and stuff like that.
Yeah, right.
He compared it to mercy, and I had a difficulty separating the two. How would you explain or give an example?
Yeah.
That's clear for a non-believer to understand.
Mercy is preventing me from getting what I deserve. Grace is giving me something I don't deserve. And so mercy, I deserve to be punished, but mercy would prevent that from happening. Grace, on the other hand, is not really connected to behavior at all. It's you're being given a gift of unfathomable value, and it has nothing to do with your behavior at all. And so for an unbeliever, there's a string attached somewhere, because all they usually think of is trades and bargains. So what do you want? And it's just like Valjean and Javert. It's like, what do you want? You want a deal? No, I don't want a deal. There's nothing. And it seems unbelievable. And so mercy, on the other hand, is still anchored in the transaction. And so it prevents something that I'm deserving of punishment. It prevents that. On the other hand, grace gives me something that I am completely undeserving of, and goes at it from that angle. So, what else? Yeah.
I think the other thing that I've noticed, kind of in the first question, is yes, like, have people like speak into things, and kind of like hit rock bottom. I think one of the biggest things, at least in my life, has been like, what do they have in their life, watching them, that I don't have, if they're able to live that way. And
Right.
I think that's something, when you just look at the scriptures, it's like, Paul probably says, imitate me more than do what I tell you to do.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that that's,
And that's hard
Yeah.
because when you imitate, you don't know how they're thinking.
Yeah.
All you see is their behavior. And so, yeah, it's kind of a rub in there because it's like, yeah, I can do what you do, but I don't think how you think to do what you do. So there's that part of it, yeah.
This is kind of like, coming like back to that idea of like figuring out like who you are based off of like other people, like,
Yeah.
you know, calling you out from behind the stained glass. But I feel like also like on the other side of it, like, what about like the times where like maybe it's less safe people, or even just like when people like unintentionally like for example, like, you maybe like show part of like your real side, like not even intentionally, like you just accidentally do something
Yeah.
that was like really real, and then somebody like responds in a negative way, like,
Right.
oh, why'd you do that? That was this, that was that.
Right.
So I feel like that just like encourages like to go back behind the stained glass. Like I didn't even mean for that to slip out, but like it did, and
Right.
the response was not correct. So why would I ever want to like? So like, how do you continue to try to like figure out who like the true self is?
Right.
If, like it doesn't seem to be like one that, and obviously I know like that's the problem with like we just want other people's acceptance, but like
Right.
what if it like really is one that's like not accepted?
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is that it's them, not us. So that means I've got to develop the kind of discernment to figure out who, you know, like you said, well, it's kind of unintentional, it comes out. And their response is entirely predictable, really, because it's like, it's alarming to see somebody act in accordance with their real self. It's alarming in the world that we're in. And so why wouldn't they react? Because it frightens them, really, and you're not cooperating with the social contract. And that is, you talk from behind your stained glass and I'll talk from behind mine. So and then, you know, choosing carefully, you know, the people that you surround yourself by, who when they give you that feedback, not that feedback, when they give you feedback, you can be reasonably assured that it's for your growth, it's not for their benefit.
I just feel like in instances like that, like it just like pushes you like so much.
Oh, no
further
doubt.
behind the stained glass. Like
I would agree.
Like had an instance like that, and was like talking with a friend about it. And
Yeah.
Like, well, I didn't mean to like react like that. Like I didn't mean to like hurt your feelings. Or,
Right.
Like, make you feel like that. But like in my head, I was like, it's not your fault at all. You were just responding how you need to respond. But like I shouldn't have acted like that.
Yeah.
But like that, and then I was thinking about it later, and I was like, that was just like, I wouldn't even like have to manufacture that.
Yeah.
Like, that was like a genuine thing that I did,
Yeah.
but it just wasn't like accepted well, I guess.
Right.
Which then made me be like, oh, I should never do that ever again.
And that's what most people say. I will never do that again. And so they stay fairly well entrenched behind that stained glass. I think that having the freedom to behave real, even in spite of the negative feedback that comes, that's what real freedom is. And you know, the one thing, and I've mentioned to you guys before that Brandon was my mentor, and of all the people I've interacted with, I have never been around anybody quite so knowable, even with all of his background and all of the baggage that he carried with him. And so asking how a day was with Brennan usually resulted in some alarming, frank, honest comments about how his day's been going. And that's what freedom looks like, is that he knew, because we were friends, but I don't think that would change much, really, with him. And some of it, you say, well, he's just getting old and he doesn't care what anybody thinks. I'm not sure Brennan has ever been that way entirely. Now, you read Abba's Child and read chapter 2 about the imposter. He clearly was at some parts of his life, and living behind the stained glass that he calls the imposter. So, I mean, we surround ourselves with as many safe people as we can, and then the other people, we have realistic expectations of how they might respond. And then if they respond the way we realistically expect them to, then there's no shock here. This is not a news flash. But it doesn't mean that what I did was wrong. And that's what we tend to do, is that we say, this didn't work, therefore what I did caused it. And what actually happened is, what happened was they reacted. And I can still remain free even though they're not. And, you know, learning this stuff, I will be quite honest with you about learning this stuff. You chart a course for living life very, 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 very differently than your peers. And you can expect pushback because they don't like the conventions being challenged. Conventions. I'm not talking about morality or anything like that, but you're not dancing the right way, and you're supposed to keep the dance going. And you know, I get it. I understand. I've been there, done that, got the T-shirt and went home. I got it. But on the other hand, one of the things I think, just between you, me, and the hedge post fence, one of the things that I think scares the spit out of Christians is living free. Is living free, rather than the conventions that we're surrounded by. And we know how to toe the line on that stuff. But so, anything else? I keep going, and I really am going to hack up along. So, okay, we'll call it. I'll see you next time, hopefully without the cough.